Hello again, and I hope you are doing well. So, you know my name, Francisca Anene, and I'm the one taking you legal drafting and conveyancing. This is another subject on the course. And of course, I know that as you take part one topic after the other, you're getting better, you are becoming excellent drafters, you are mastering the art of legal writing, and you are becoming more skillful. So let's see what today's topic has for us to learn, and let's make progress. Progress is going to be on both ends. You will need to listen, take notes, pay attention, answer the questions, take part in all the activities, and I will also do the teaching and I will answer whatever questions you have during an online class. So let's not waste time. Let's just go. Okay. So this is our fourth lesson, and we'll be looking at interpretation of statutes. Some of the things you will learn in this lesson will be the meaning of the interpretation of statutes, different rules and tools of interpretation, and the limits of the exercise of the judicial duty of interpretation of statutes. The term interpretation of statute means seeking to unravel or discover the meaning of a statute. Again, it is an art. So, what is done is to try and discover the intention of the lawmaker, that is the legislature, in order to give effect to a law. And interpretation of statute is a judicial function. It is the judges that interpret statutes. However, in doing that, they don't become lawmakers themselves. It's important to draw, a clear distinction between lawmaking and law interpretation. Now, in interpreting statutes, the traditional view was just to apply the plain meaning, whether or not the statute makes sense using the plain meaning or not. However, there is a shift to a purposive approach. So, the interpreter is required to look at the purpose of the statute. And the whole point of this approach is so that you can properly give effect to the intention of the drafter, the legislature, in order for justice to be done. In interpreting statutes, the doctrine of stare decisis will apply in the fact that a higher court, whatever a higher court interprets a statute to be, will be bound on the lower court to apply. There are various tools for interpretation. It is important that you differentiate between tools of interpretation and rules of interpretation. Rules of interpretation are principles that were distilled out of various judges, common law cases. Tools of interpretation are the various sources and the various materials that a judge may look at in order to interpret a statute. Some are not binding, others are binding. So for now, we are talking about the tools, not the rules. The first tool is the Interpretation Act. It is a law of its on its own, of course, so it is binding. It is used where there is no express definition section or where a particular law refers to the act. And then you have the interpretation section of various laws which define particular words in context in which it should be used for the purpose of that law. Another tool is punctuations. Punctuations form part of legislation, and their purpose is to clarify absurdity and to make the law less clumsy. Then you have the long title and the preamble, which tries to explain the purpose for which the law was enacted and the scope of the legislation, so they are quite useful. Other tools are law dictionaries, which are actually used where there is no judicial or statutory guidance available. And in using a law dictionary, you assign the literal meaning of a word to it. And then you have legal texts, which this could include textbooks, commentaries, monographs, and so on. Now, they are not binding. However, judges can refer to them, but they will become binding if a higher court, because of the principle of stare decisis, of course, if a higher court applies them, then a lower court is duty bound to follow the application or the adoption of a legal text as a source or a tool for interpretation, right? Law dictionaries and legal texts, as I said, are not binding. And then decisions of superior courts, where there's no other source for defining or interpreting controversial words, courts may define them. And when they do this, it will be binding under the doctrine of stare decisis. So any court below a court that gives a decision that goes to interpretation will be duty bound, of course, to apply the decision given by the higher court. Then your last tool is the rules, canons of interpretation, which, as I said, are rules developed by common law judges over time, particularly in England. So to our first activity, I'd like you to think about 6 tools for interpretation of statutes and talk about their relevance. Okay, now to the rules of interpretation. There are a number of them, and for the, there are up to 9 actually from in your course material, but I will be explaining only 3 of them for time's sake. The others we will explain during our live class. So they are you have the literal rule, the rule, the mischief rule, the purposive approach, ejusdem generis, utres magis valeat quam pariat, expressio unus est exclusio ulterius, nocitur associs, and contra proferentem. Now, as I said, I will be explaining the first 3 English rules. The purposive and the Latin maxims we will talk about during the live class. To the literal rule. The literal rule is also called the primary or plain rule of interpretation. And basically, it just says that statutes should be given their plain and ordinary grammatical meaning. So legislatures, in writing a particular statute in the way it is written, are presumed to know what they want, and so they are presumed to mean what they say and say what they mean. In that case, therefore, it is not up to the interpreter to assign a different meaning to that rule. The principle was founded in success peerage case and has been applied in various cases in Nigeria, most significantly at 101 Shagari, where the court had to interpret the meaning of 2/3 of 19 states. There are problems with a literal interpretation, of course. First of all, people will definitely have different perspectives, whether or not the wording is plain, and they will therefore reach different conclusions on the basis of their perspectives. Then, of course, a society changes over time. So law must be able to adapt to the functions and functioning of the society over time. It's important that that is borne in mind. Then, of course, a word may have both the core meaning and the fringe meaning. So it's not enough to just apply a plain English definition to a word. And now to the golden rule. The golden rule of interpretation states that where strict application of the literal rule will lead to inconsistency, absurdity, injustice, or hardship, then the interpreter should modify the word that is giving the problem in order to discover the intention of the legislature. Note that the golden rule only becomes relevant if a literal interpretation, is not able to solve the problem, or if a literal interpretation results in absurdity, inconsistency, and all of that, and your authority is gray and person. The golden rule has also been applied in Nigeria in Bronick Motors and Wema Bank. And to the mischief rule, which is the last we'll talk about in this lesson. It is called the rule in Haydon's case because it's in that rule that the principles were established. And the whole point of the mischief rule, again, like the golden rule, follows from the literal rule, is that if a statute has failed to cure a mischief, then apply the mischief rule in order to cure that mischief. So in some way, the mischief rule also seeks to bridge a gap. But there are four thoughts that the judge must have in mind. First, he has to consider what was the law before the statute, and then what was the defect in that law, previous law, that the statute tried to deal with, and then what was the remedy proposed by the statute and the rationale behind that remedy. After thinking of all of that, then the court can decide what that mischief is and then now propose a better remedy, a better way of interpreting the statute in order to provide a better remedy. So the mischief rule has advantages, and of course it's been criticized. It is the rule recognizes the changing function of law in a society, which the literal rule does not recognize. And the rule can be used to avoid hardships occasioned by the literal rule. But some parties still feel that the rule encourages judicial activism, which they believe is a means of the courts to usurp the power of the legislature. And of course, they say sometimes, even when a mischief does not exist, people use the rule to advance new policies, which they should not. So, to our second activity, I want you to answer this question. In what cases will the court look beyond the plain meaning of the words of a statute during interpretation? Okay, so we have learnt in this lesson the meaning and purpose of interpretation of statutes, the tools of interpretation, and the major rules of interpretation. And we have explained the literal rule, the golden rule, and the mischief rule. So as download this video and watch it again and again. And if you have any questions, you can post it on the discussion forum and we'll discuss it. So until we meet at the live class where we will speak more about this topic and explain better, particularly those rules that are based on Latin maxims. I want to thank you for watching this video, and I encourage you to pay attention, and I'll see you at our next class.